Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're not just reading history. We are, I think, tracing one of the most complex intellectual struggles in religious history.
We really are.
We're diving into how the early church defined and then defended and ultimately standardized the doctrine of the Trinity.
It's the ultimate theological deep dive, and the challenge facing those first thinkers was just enormous. I mean, imagine taking a faith rooted entirely in the Jewish cultural framework.
Right, in the Old Testament.
In the Old Testament, and the idea of Yahweh as this transcendent, singular God, and then suddenly having to make it comprehensible to a vast Greco-Roman audience.
An audience just steeped in Plato, Aristotle, and Zeno.
Completely.
That transition must have been a cultural shockwave. Christianity moved so rapidly from a Jewish setting into Gentile thought, where, Greek philosophy was the common language.
It was the lingua franca, yeah.
So they had to talk about God and Jesus to people who had no background in the covenant or prophecy. So the core task was set, right? How do you translate the unique claim of Christ into a language the philosophical world already speaks?
Precisely. And the goal for the apologists, these were the first Christian philosophers writing mostly in the 2nd century. It was really threefold. They had to affirm the truth about God and Christ.
Okay.
They had to exclude error through, careful, rational argument. And they had to vindicate the Christ-centered worship of God using whatever rational resources were available. And it all hinged on one question.
Who exactly was Jesus of Nazareth?
That's it.
And the answer they landed on was, well, it was revolutionary, wasn't it? And rooted in the very fabric of Greek thought. Jesus is the logos of God incarnate.
And logos here is a very specific term. It's defined as the principle of rationality. I mean, the thought, the wisdom, the eternal plan of God, which was somehow given a personal, distinct existence.
Apart from the source, the Father.
Yes, the word made person.
That's a huge step, though. You're arguing God's eternal reason decided to, just walk around as a distinct person? But if the logos is distinct, how did they protect the strict monotheism they got from Judaism?
Right. They couldn't be seen as introducing a second, inferior God.
So how do they manage that?
Well, they struggled with it constantly. And they used those famous analogies to explain distinction without separation. Think of the logos as distinct from God the source. Like a ray of light is distinct from the lamp.
Or a stream from its source.
Or a stream from its source, exactly. The logos is personal in his own right, but dependent on the Father for his being.
That's powerful imagery. And the apologists didn't just conjure this term out of thin air, did they? It was a known quantity.
Oh, it was everywhere. Philo, a Jewish Platonist from the 1st century BC, he saw the logos as this transcendent mediating principle, the thing that bridges the infinite gap between God and the created cosmos.
And then you had the Stoics.
And then you had the Stoics, going all the way back to Zeno, who saw the logos as an immanent principle, the rationality and order that was already permeating the cosmos.
Holding everything together.
Yes. So the apologists were skillfully using a concept that was familiar to pretty much every educated person in the empire.
Okay, here's where the journey gets really messy, I think, and sets up centuries of debate. The reversal of John's gospel. John's prologue moves the reader from the logos, this divine first reality, to sonship. The logos became flesh. You're led to understand the logos is the Son.
But the early theologians, people like Justin Martyr, they went the other way. They started with Jesus, the Son of God, and then moved to the logos category.
So they treated the philosophical logos idea as if it were more fundamental, more illuminating than sonship.
Exactly. Specifically to explain Jesus to philosophical outsiders. And this strategic shortcut, defining the Son with the philosophical category, it had massive, almost devastating consequences later on.
It sounds like they traded immediate evangelistic clarity for a long-term doctrinal headache. Because if you define the Son primarily as something derived, like a ray from a lamp,
he starts to look secondary.
Right, a secondary product, not just a distinct person.
You hit the nail on the head. That ray stream analogy, while it was meant to affirm derivation without, ontological separation, it led to a great deal of head-scratching among ordinary believers.
If the Son is like a stream, is he as mighty as the source?
That's the question. And this uncertainty, it opened the door for all these alternative explanations in the 3rd century.
And the most intuitive but ultimately incorrect way people tried to simplify it was modalism.
Exactly, Sabellianism. This declared that God is only one person, but that person just changes modes or roles.
Like an actor.
Like an actor, yeah. Sometimes appearing as the Father, sometimes the Son, sometimes the Spirit. It just rejected the idea of 3 distinct persons to keep the unity.
But the other far more dangerous problem came from that philosophical idea they had leaned on. The Greek axiom that which is derived is always less in its own nature than that from which it's derived.
This was the real bomb waiting to go off. If the Logos was derived, thinkers like Origen started suggesting the Son was of a weaker strain, a secondary deity.
Inherently inferior.
Inherently inferior to the Father. And this weakness then just erupted into the massive empire-splitting crisis of Arianism.
Arius. A very articulate presbyter in Alexandria, he took that philosophical idea and just crystallized it into this clear, devastating formula.
Arius's formulation was, it was direct.
Okay.
If the Son was begotten, there was a time when he was not. Therefore, the Logos was the first creature God brought into existence.
The first, and the Holy Spirit was the second.
Yes. Creatures of high dignity, but ultimately still creatures. He suggested they could be called God only by a courtesy title.
Like a Roman emperor being declared divine because of his office, not his nature.
Precise.
But wait, so if the Son is a creature, no matter how powerful, doesn't that make the worship of Christ idolatry? I mean, that's not a semantic argument. That's about salvation itself.
That was the existential crisis that forced the world to stop. Athanasius, the champion of Trinitarian orthodoxy, he argued fiercely. If the Son is a creature, he cannot redeem creation. Only God himself can save us.
To ensure salvation, the Son had to be co-eternal and co-equal.
Had to be. And this crisis got so intense that Emperor Constantine, seeing his unified empire being torn apart by theology, he was forced to call the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
And Athanasius produced that famous non-negotiable formula in the Nicene Creed that drew the line in the sand.
The Son is homoousios to patria, being of one substance with the Father. This single Greek term was the only way to surgically excise Arianism. It settled co-equality once and for all.
And it wasn't enough to say the Son was of similar substance, was it? That one letter was crucial.
It was everything. The Arians were happy to say homoousios, similar substance. But Athanasius insisted on homoousios, same substance, to protect two key thoughts at the same time.
Okay, what were they?
First, co-equality. Father and Son share the identical, non-created divine essence, equal dignity. And second, personal distinction. They are still distinct persons within that unity of being.
That's the powerful legacy of Nicaea. It built the ring fence of orthodoxy, which was later reaffirmed at Constantinople in 381.
And that theological structure was continually refined. Centuries later, in the 16th century, John Calvin explicitly stated something that was implicit at Nicaea, that the three persons are co-eternal.
Which eliminated any lingering idea of temporal derivation.
Any question of God who was maybe unipersonal, somehow developing into three persons over time, it shut that door.
So we have this hard-fought creedal definition, a fence built by Nicaea that defined the essence. But let's jump ahead to the modern age. If the 4th century focused on essence, how did thinkers 1,500 years later make this dense formula relevant to daily life?
Well, the 19th century was characterized by liberal theology, which, frankly, had reduced the Trinity to near Unitarianism.
Just one divine person whose reflection was found most perfectly in Jesus.
Exactly. It wasn't the historical or biblical doctrine, and theologians in the 20th century realized it just wasn't good enough.
And this led to a major theological revival that changed how we talk about God.
It did. The watershed moment came in 1943 with the Anglican theologian Leonard Hodgson. He essentially insisted that the old reluctance to call the Father, Son, and Spirit persons in the full, ordinary sense needed to end.
That's a huge break. Because before, you had theologians like Augustine and Karl Barth who were worried that using the word person would imply three separate individuals.
Right, who weren't truly one God, so they used terms like modes of being or subsistences to avoid that problem.
But Hodgson broke with that.
Completely. He argued that God is a society, and the divine three are persons in the full sense, and in fact are more personal than humans are. They're perfectly integrated, perfectly cooperating, wholly unified.
And contemporary theology has largely settled on this view.
For the most part, yes. Thinking of the three as fully personal, integrated, and awesome.
So the human definition of personhood is actually derived from God's personhood, not the other way around. And this is where the doctrine really connects to our lives today, isn't it? What is the current contribution?
The view of the Trinity as a relational archetype. Psychology and sociology have shown us today that human life is intrinsically relational. Our individuality isn't found in isolation.
It's realized, heightened, and defined within relationships.
Within relationships, friendship, family, community, life is relationships.
I think we all feel that instinctively. To be fully human is to be fully engaged with others. So the argument is that This created relationality in us derives from the uncreated relationality of the Godhead.
Precisely. The inner life of the Godhead, the perichoresis or circle dance of the Father, Son, and Spirit, constantly relating, giving, and receiving love eternally. That's the uncreated blueprint for human relationality. They are the ultimate model of individuality realized in perfect community.
It takes the Nicaea formula and makes it profoundly relevant.
To how we understand ourselves and our fulfillment in society, yes.
To really appreciate that perfect relationship, that divine team dynamic, we have to nail down a key distinction that sometimes trips people up.
Yeah.
The difference between the Essential Trinity and the Economic Trinity.
This is crucial for clear thinking. The Essential Trinity is the Trinity ad intra-God as he is in himself. In this sphere, there is absolute co-equality.
No one is greater or less than the others in nature or power.
No hierarchy whatsoever.
And the Economic Trinity. That sounds like God balancing the books.
It's the Trinity in action or ministry, their joint operation in the world, in creation, redemption. The term economic comes from the Greek oikonomia, meaning housekeeping or management. It's their team dynamic.
Okay, let's use an illustration. If the Essential Trinity is who they are, how do we illustrate what they do in the Economic Trinity without making the sons seem inferior?
Think of it like a perfectly integrated design and construction firm. They are all equal partners. That's the Essential Trinity. Same capital, same authority. But for a project, the Economic Trinity, they have functional roles.
So the Father initiates the plan.
The Father initiates, lays out the vision. The Son complies, accepts the vision, and incarnates the design. And the Spirit executes it, ensuring construction gets completed. This difference in function does not negate the co-equality of their divine essence.
That functional role, that compliance, it doesn't imply inferiority. And we see that tension balanced beautifully in the Gospels. Jesus will say, I live through the Father, pointing to that eternal dependence.
But then John 5.22 affirms the Father has entrusted all judgment to the Son. And why?
So that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father.
Exactly. You cannot honor the Son just as you honor the Father if the Son is merely a glorified creature. Equal honor demands essential co-equality, even when they perform different functions.
Now let's shift briefly to the very first manifestation of that economic operation. Creation. Our sources are clear. This goes beyond our human ability to just make things out of raw materials.
Scripture consistently pictures God's creation as orderly formation that banishes chaos. Chaos is disorder, shambles. In Genesis 1, the Spirit is hovering, the Word is speaking, and the Father is commanding.
Establishing order out of nothing. Which brings us to the famous phrase, creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Why was that so important for the early church to define?
Well, that description, which reflects passages in 2 Maccabees and Hebrews, was specifically formulated to counter Greek philosophy. Plato, for instance, assumed God shaped pre-existing formless matter.
But the biblical concept says no.
It says there wasn't any matter at all until God spoke it into existence.
So ex nihilo is a statement about God's absolute power and control.
It is. And what's interesting is this ancient assertion meshes surprisingly well with modern cosmology, specifically the Big Bang Theory. You're forced to ask the critical question, what was it that went bang?
You don't get cosmic explosions out of nothing.
You don't. The Christian answer is that whatever material existed to go bang was God's creation, called into being by his word at a moment in time when literally nothing was there previously.
This journey has been a masterclass in intellectual rigor. From the early strategic use of the logos concept, through the necessary painful definitions required at Nicaea, up to this vibrant modern understanding of God as a profoundly personal and relational archetype.
It really demonstrates that theology isn't static. It's constantly evolving as thinkers strive not just to believe the doctrine, but to understand its implications. And the doctrine of the Trinity, as confessed in the creeds, that complex formula, it should ultimately be seen as a ring fence.
A ring fence that keeps the bad ideas out and guides the true seeker inward.
Exactly. It's a boundary around the truest possible statement we can make about the living God. It's a verbal marker that says, if you want to study the truth about God further, dig here. Excavate within the frame of this confession.
So the creeds aren't meant to stifle thought.
Not at all. They're meant to ensure that deep thought doesn't stray into destructive anti-salvific error.
That's a perfect challenge, using the fence not as a limit, but as a guide for focused excavation. We encourage you to continue exploring that idea, the Godhead as the relational archetype, and to keep practicing that key distinction between his essential co-equality and his economic operation. That's all the time we have for this deep dive.